Richard Gere, the silver-haired icon of grace, heart, and depth in Hollywood, has captivated the world for decades, not only with his unforgettable performances, but also with a deep and consistent commitment to justice, compassion, and the quiet dignity of service. As one of the most recognizable leading men in film history, Gere built his legacy not on sensationalism or controversy, but on the foundation of integrity, purpose, and quiet strength. So when the news finally emerged that Richard Gere had meticulously outlined what would happen to his vast fortune after his passing, it wasn't the jaw-dropping numbers that grabbed attention. It was the soul-stirring story behind his choices. His decision, reflecting a lifetime of conviction, left fans stunned, emotional, and deeply moved. Richard Gere never conformed to Hollywood's flashier currents. Where others chased fame, he sought meaning. Where others collected real estate and headlines, he collected experiences, purpose, and wisdom. Over the course of his career, Gere amassed a fortune estimated to be in the hundreds of millions. With decades of box office successes, savvy investments in real estate, and even quiet forays into production and development, he had the means to do almost anything money could buy. But rather than simply preserve it for the usual heirs and beneficiaries, Gere took a different path, one that perfectly aligned with the values he had demonstrated his entire life. From the start, Gere was never just an actor. A devoted student of Zen Buddhism, he often spoke about the impermanence of life, the dangers of attachment, and the spiritual poverty of unchecked materialism. While his performance in Pretty Woman skyrocketed his fame and fortune, he continued to champion human rights issues, especially those surrounding the plight of the Tibetan people. His friendship with the Dalai Lama and his outspoken criticism of the Chinese government's occupation of Tibet made him a political pariah in some circles, but he never wavered. That same moral courage would later inform every decision regarding his estate. For Gere, philanthropy wasn't a vanity project. It was an extension of who he was. Through the Gere Foundation, he funded healthcare initiatives for HIV/AIDS, supported countless refugee programs, and donated millions to fight poverty. His foundation quietly worked with grassroots organizations across the globe, often without fanfare. Friends say Gere never felt comfortable broadcasting his acts of kindness, but now, with the unveiling of his will, the sheer magnitude of what he planned to leave behind left everyone speechless. The most striking revelation wasn't the amount of money, though substantial, it was the intention behind it that cut to the heart. Rather than leaving the bulk of his wealth to family members or Hollywood institutions, Gere chose to give the majority of his estate to a series of causes that had defined his life: spiritual centers promoting compassion and mindfulness, Tibetan refugee organizations, underfunded rural hospitals in Southeast Asia, and environmental groups committed to preserving natural landscapes across the globe. For many fans, this decision wasn't just generous. It was deeply emotional. It felt like the closing chapter of a life lived with rare sincerity. Gere's connection to Buddhism had never been performative. He spent years studying in monasteries, learning not just from books, but through silence, discipline, and retreat. He was a disciple of simplicity. Even when his peers flaunted lavish lifestyles, Gere remained grounded. His home in Pound Ridge, New York, though elegant, was a peaceful retreat surrounded by woods, not a flashy mansion intended to impress. His wealth wasn't for display. It was a means to serve. One of the most emotional portions of Gere's planned estate included a massive donation, well over $50 million, to initiatives supporting Tibetan children displaced from their homeland. These funds were earmarked for education, shelter, and cultural preservation, ensuring that an entire generation would not lose their identity to exile. Gere's love for the Tibetan people, born out of spiritual kinship and moral obligation, had often cost him politically. He was banned from presenting at the Oscars for years after using his platform to criticize the Chinese government. But he never apologized for speaking the truth. His fortune now stood as a monument to that courage, a final act of defiance and compassion rolled into one. In addition to his international philanthropy, Gere quietly created a trust that would fund hospice care centers across America, particularly in underserved rural communities. He believed that the end of life deserved the same dignity as the beginning. This wasn't just an idea. He had witnessed firsthand the lonely, underfunded conditions many elderly patients endure in their final days. His goal was to create centers of calm, peace, and respect for the dying. These weren't just donations. They were acts of love, reaching across time to people he would never meet. And yet, amid all the international efforts, Gere never forgot his roots. Born in Philadelphia and raised in upstate New York, Gere remained closely connected to the values of humility, hard work, and quiet perseverance that shaped his upbringing. A significant portion of his estate was designated for scholarships to state colleges, trade schools, and creative arts programs, especially for students from working-class families. He wanted to help those who had dreams bigger than their means, just like he once did. For every young artist struggling to make ends meet, for every student held back by tuition costs, Gere's gesture was a lifeline, a whisper across time that someone believed in them. Those closest to Gere knew he had been preparing this for years. While he kept the details private, he often spoke in general terms about his desire to leave behind something meaningful. Not a statue, not a studio named in his honor, but real, sustained impact. In personal letters included in the foundation's files, Gere wrote eloquently about the need to transcend ego, to resist the illusion of legacy as self-glorification. He urged those who would one day manage his wealth to resist becoming gatekeepers and instead be stewards, guides, not owners, of the future. Perhaps most surprising to fans was that Gere's gifts weren't limited to institutions or programs. In a rare twist, he left a sizable fund to be distributed annually, quietly, by a group of trusted advisors, specifically to individuals who had committed their lives to service, but never received recognition. Social workers, hospice nurses, environmental field scientists, Buddhist monks working in the slums of Nepal. These were the heroes Gere wanted to uplift. The fund, called the Silent Light, would identify such individuals every year and provide them with what Gere called a blessing, not a reward, money to continue their mission or simply to rest and restore. The emotional weight of this decision struck many who followed Gere's career. This wasn't just generosity, it was deeply spiritual. It was the expression of a man who had spent his entire life asking not what do I want, but what is needed. And in the end, what was needed, he believed, was to leave the world, not with applause, but with a whisper of kindness that would ripple long after he was gone. What makes his story even more profound is that Gere had experienced his own share of personal sorrow. His marriage to model Cindy Crawford, while dazzling to the public eye, ended after 4 years. His later marriage to actress Carrie Lowell also ended in divorce, though the two shared a son, Homer. Yet in his private life, especially in his later years, Gere found peace. He remarried Alejandra Silva, a Spanish publicist and activist nearly 3 decades his junior, and together they had 2 children. Those who know him say fatherhood brought him deep joy and emotional grounding. But even in planning his estate, Gere was careful to balance love for his family with a commitment to the broader human family. His children were provided for, but the lion's share of his wealth went outward, to the world he felt responsible for. It's not uncommon for celebrities to leave behind foundations or make large end-of-life donations. But Richard Gere's estate struck a different chord. It was intentional, personal, even poetic. It wasn't the act of a man seeking posthumous praise. It was the final verse of a lifelong song, a melody of compassion, faith, and stillness. In a noisy world, fans across the world reacted not with shock, but with emotion. Messages poured into his foundation. Stories were shared online by people who had crossed paths with Gere over the years. Stories of small kindnesses, of him showing up unannounced at a hospital, or slipping a struggling musician a check backstage after a charity concert. These weren't publicized acts. They were private truths. The idea that a man who had once been the epitome of cinematic charm would choose to fade into history with such selflessness struck a nerve. In a world that often worships wealth for its own sake, Gere's decision was radical in its humility. And for fans who had watched him evolve, not just as an actor but as a human being, it was the perfect ending. One fan wrote online, "Richard Gere didn't just act in love stories. He lived one, with the world." The true measure of a legacy isn't just in numbers or buildings. It's in the impact on lives unseen, the seeds planted quietly that bloom long after the gardener is gone. Richard Gere may have been adored for his roles on the big screen, but in the final act of his life, He gave the world something far greater than entertainment. He gave it a blueprint for grace, for giving, and for living with intention. And that, more than any fortune or fame, is what makes people cry. Not out of sorrow, but gratitude. Because in Richard Gere's story, we see the possibility of a different kind of greatness, one that whispers instead of shouts, that gives instead of takes, and that, even in death, reminds us how to live.